was based on the conditions in the Middle East. Why would Malala take a stand?
Oh. Why would she take a stand?
Yeah.
So, in terms of the question, are you looking for understanding why a young girl would do this, or can you give me a little bit more background as to what you're looking for? What she did was a bit unusual, on the basis of customs and and what's expected, in terms of behavior of young girls.
So why, because she's a young girl, why would she be forced to take a stand the way she did?
Oh, so now I don't know that she was forced to take a stand.
Well, yeah.
Yeah, so my understanding, and I'm not an expert on her in particular, I've just followed the news. My understanding is that she saw an injustice, or something she perceived as an injustice, that most of us in the West would also see as injustice. And she stood up to that, which would be not really the customary behavior for a young girl or a woman, even. But her position with regard to, as I understand it, with regard to education and her rights as an individual are also held by her family. So she's not alone in her position and her thoughts with regard to, say, Taliban rule or influence, but she is most likely in a minority, well, kind of obviously in a minority in terms of people who seem to speak up and act out, to promote their version of their rights, and in direct opposition to the Taliban.
Okay. The second question is, how has the Taliban taken advantage of the Islamic religion?
Okay, so it's an interesting question. The Taliban, first of all, is not just one organization. So if you're talking about the Taliban, you might, it's useful to know that there's a Taliban in Afghanistan, and there's a Taliban in Pakistan, and there's a group called Tehrik-e-Taliban, Pakistan, as well. So there are as many as 3 or more Taliban organizations, and they're not all the same. For instance, the Taliban in Afghanistan is a little bit less violent in some ways than is the Taliban in Pakistan. They do have some presumed state support, meaning that there is some record for some, I don't know if I should say strong assumption that high up within some elements of Pakistani society there is support for the Taliban to do what they do. But with regard to the Taliban, they exercise or practice a fundamentalist version of Islam, which is not necessarily the set of practices that most people who are Muslims share, or not the moderate majority of the Muslim world. Rather, it's just their own, not their own. It's definitely one of the kind of subdivisions within Islam. It just happens to be more fundamentalist, which we would understand to be more extremist.
Yeah.
And so that's what they teach and what they presumably practice. It's just not necessarily what the majority of people within the Muslim community practice or even prefer. The Muslim community is, it's a very large community that covers, multiple continents and has a lot of diversity within it. Not so unlike, well, there's some differences, but you might imagine, like Christianity with Catholicism, Orthodoxy, Protestantism, and other various divisions. Islam has the same thing. So Taliban is just one of those many divisions of the religion, with a more fundamentalist, extremist perspective or ideology.
Do you have an example of, a certain thing that, people who study, Islamic stuff, do you have an example of how the Taliban has taken advantage, a certain thing that people believe in that the Taliban has used against them?
I don't think I have a good example. I'm trying to think of one. But I could reiterate and maybe emphasize that the Taliban exercises, I don't know if I'd use the word take advantage, maybe that's part of the problem. Because they have an interpretation, that the members of the Taliban have an interpretation of Islam that they practice and more or less preach, but preach isn't quite the right word, not preach in terms of go to church preach, but preach in terms of replicate or, use.
Yeah.
It is not consistent. So their version is as a fundamentalist version of Islam. I'm not a religious scholar. I just want to emphasize this. But this question comes up every once in a while, or something related comes up every once in a while. So I've done a little bit of digging into it. It's not mainstream Sunniism. Sunniism is the largest community within the Muslim religions. There are Sunnis and there are Shia and there are other subdivisions that wouldn't identify as either one.
Yeah.
But I would imagine that secular Muslims, so I'm not going to give you a good example, but in general, secular Muslims who are Sunnis would not, raise their families by choice in a Taliban, in a manner consistent with the Taliban's teachings or practices. But in terms of, abuses of power, there are many examples of that, mostly in Afghanistan. And I think that what Malala stood up against was one of those perceived or real abuses of their power.
Okay. For question 3, how are women and children treated in the Middle East compared to how they're treated in America?
So the Middle East is really diverse as well. And oftentimes, when you're thinking of the Middle East, you might be thinking of the Arabian Peninsula and that area of land that is in the Eastern Mediterranean, where Lebanon and Israel are located, in Syria. There's a lot of diversity with regard to how women are treated in different parts of this geographic area across the countries, and there has been change over time as well. So it kind of depends on whether the government is secular or religious, and in most cases the government is secular, so there are exceptions on a regional basis. There are a couple of ways to kind of look at the question to the extent that religion or religious practices or beliefs might inform how women are treated. But alternatively, if the state is sufficiently strong, women have certain rights and, protections, just like any other citizen within those societies. So if you're looking at the, say, Lebanon or the Palestinian territories, which are two very small little areas, there's a lot of diversity even there. And those are bordering countries. Two little tiny bordering countries, well, Palestinian territories is part of Israel, right there along the Eastern Mediterranean. There's a lot of variation. So in the Gaza Strip, which is one of the Palestinian territories, women are starting to veil more often, which means covering their heads and their full bodies, the full veil. They are, so basically not allowed to show themselves in public. And that's pretty consistent with practices in Saudi Arabia and other the small Arab countries like the United Arab Emirates. But if you're in the West Bank, which is the larger of the Palestinian territories within Israel, women aren't forced to veil or even necessarily encouraged. That part of the Palestinian territories is governed primarily by Fatah, which is a political party, and it's a secular political party, and they aren't as interested in reinforcing religious beliefs as part of their political system, in contrast to Hamas, which is a religious party that's primarily in control of the Gaza Strip. If you go north to Lebanon, you have a multi-sectarian society, which is largely Maronite Christian, also Shia Muslim and Sunni Muslim. But women are protected within that system by the state, the Lebanese state. Though the state is too weak to enforce its authority over all of its territory. Even despite that, I don't know that the Shia Islamist party forces women to, veil or to cover themselves or treat them any different. And that's kind of in contrast to, so that's the Shia Islamist party, Sunni Islamist party, the Shia Islamist party in southern Lebanon, and the Sunni Islamist party in the Gaza Strip. That's in comparison to, say, the Taliban, which is an Islamist. You might call it a party, but it's not really a party. It's a political actor, and the way they force bailing and keep women at home and prevent education or make education illegal. So those are three different examples. But then if you go into Saudi Arabia, it's quite different. Saudi Arabia is much bigger territory, and in Saudi Arabia, women have their limitations to women's rights. My understanding is women aren't allowed to do things such as drive. They are fully veiled while they're in Saudi Arabia. But I believe they have access to education and things of that sort. And Saudi Arabia has a state religion, which is similar to Salafism. So that in Saudi Arabia, the state teaches Wahhabism, which is one version of Sunni Islam. And that's quite similar to Salafism, which is practiced by some in Afghanistan in particular, but elsewhere. So Al-Qaeda and all of its affiliates claim to be Salafists, as does ISIS claim to be Salafists. But women seem to have fewer rights in Saudi Arabia than they do, say, in Lebanon or the Palestinian territories.
So
I would think that in Pakistan, women under Taliban-controlled area may have even fewer rights and protections because there isn't a rule of law that's enforced by a secular entity. So secular means non-religious. But in Saudi Arabia, even though they practice this fundamentalist interpretation of Islam, and women seem to have fewer rights and are lower down the hierarchy, within the overall hierarchy of society, they're protected in Saudi Arabia.
why do you?
Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, sorry. Why do you think that we are given more rights in America rather than giving more rights to women in other countries?
Why do women have more rights in America than they do elsewhere?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a good question. There's more than one answer to the question.
Okay.
So part of it has to do with our culture.
Okay.
Our culture of democracy, which has gotten better over time in terms of our understanding of how democracy works. But of course, women haven't always had rights.
Yeah.
But many segments of our society, including people who are illiterate, or people, based on skin color, or people based on whether or not they own property, have variously been excluded from representation in our political system. But we have over time incorporated more and more segments of our society within our democracy, and that includes women. So that's part of our political culture. I think it's also part of just the way our culture has developed over time. So women having rights is pretty consistent across the Western world, and protections for those rights are pretty consistent across the Western world. But we also live in the United States, in one of the more prosperous, freer societies of the world. And so part of our understanding of that freedom is freedom for women as well. But our rights aren't equally protected in all parts of the Western world. So there are other places where women got the right to vote much, much later, like in Switzerland, than they did in the United States. It just seems to be part of our culture, and something that we have protected through legal processes and judicial processes over time.
Okay.
That's one answer. I mean, you can imagine other answers to that same question.
Yeah. For question number 4, what are the reasons for the restrictions that the Taliban put down? Like, why did they want to restrict the rights? Like, why did they want to restrict rights directly affecting women and children?
My understanding, and I'm not a religious scholar, but my understanding of the Taliban and where they come from, in terms of their interpretation of Islam, is that women are not, more or less second-class citizens, some way of thinking about it. It's a male-dominated society. It's an authoritarian society, and I mean that in a kind of a cultural sense, not so much a political sense, but there's a hierarchy within the society, and religious scholars in particular, at the top of that hierarchy, and they're all men, and so there's a place within their society reserved for men men in particular, and women just aren't. They're not seen the same as they are in the West in terms of having rights and liberties and obligations and responsibilities outside of the home, which of course developed over time in the West as well. The United States is kind of a young country in the world, but a lot of our ideas with regard to rights and liberties aren't unique to the United States. We share those with our European, cousins, or, the places where many immigrants to the United States came from. And so the United States, certainly, as this relatively young country, has benefited from those Western values or culture, customs that we brought with us. But keeping that in mind, it might be relevant that women have a place in other societies as well that is protected, and some of those are historical and they're not all Western. But that history isn't as evident in the Middle East or within Islamist parties. Islamist parties are political parties that want to establish legal systems that are consistent with religion. That separation of church and state isn't necessarily an understanding that's shared amongst Islamist parties. They wouldn't see church and state as separate. In fact, state would be subsumed under church, and religious law would be the law for many of the most extreme political parties. There are a combination of reasons why. Maybe also because women have, placed those demands within our societies. But women, getting our right to vote in the early 1900s, that's hundreds of years after, after women. I mean, it's a gradual process of empowerment that we benefit from here in the United States.
Okay. Our fifth question is, how does the Taliban justify their rule over Middle Eastern places like Pakistan? What do they use to justify them taking over?
Okay, so my understanding of the answer to your question is that they use Islam and understand they use religion. And they understand their interpretation of Islam to be the correct interpretation of Islam. And as tends to be true with fundamentalist movements or groups, they don't see other, maybe more moderate or more mainstream understandings of Islam to be legitimate. So it's kind of black or white. Either you're with them or you're not with them. You're either good or evil. And there's not a lot of middle ground. So my understanding is that they use Islam. They use their interpretation of religious teachings of the Quran to substantiate their practices.
So if
mind again, there's more than one Taliban, so they are very similar in their activities. There is more than one.
So if Malala reads their Bible as that she deserves a right to education and more rights as a human, and she disagrees with them only on that subject but not anything else, she would be against them?
Presumably, yeah. Presumably she would be against them if she sees herself as being entitled to rights that leaders within the Taliban do not agree with.
Okay.
Now, what's interesting here is I said authoritarian culture earlier, and I said, more like culture, not politics.
Mm-hmm.
There's not, so I should say it again, and just repeat it, there's not a single answer to many of the questions you've asked. There are competing answers, and we don't necessarily have one answer. We have varying understandings and varying interpretations of events. But one of the understandings, one of the arguments out there, so I'm going to throw something else in if you're ready. When you get to questions like you're asking, there is I'm really trying to get at, there's no single truth. There are different understandings, and some of these questions will have different answers depending on who you ask. If you ask me, and I tell you I'm not a scholar of Islam, I haven't studied Pakistan or Malala in particular, but I do study terrorism and political violence, how that works in these places. The Taliban is a group of interest to me, and my understanding of how and why the Taliban does what it does would be different from other people's understanding of the same thing, because we view things differently. We have different understandings of what matters most in terms of explaining these things. So if you're in my college class at UNR, you might find out that we don't have an answer to these questions. We have competing answers and debates. So
Yeah.
some of us might say this, and some of us might say that. We might have support for our varying perspectives. So that being said, maybe you can repeat the question so I can answer it. But that being said, keep in mind that my answer may be different from others.
Okay. Well, we only have 2 questions left, so the next one is
Oh, I was telling you about authoritarian culture, but I can leave that out for now if you like.
what?
I'm sorry, I remembered what I was telling you about before I went off on my rant about different theories. Authoritarian culture. Some will argue that there's an authoritarian culture in many Middle Eastern states, and that culture presumes that people like you and me would not question authorities. The authorities, who the religious scholars would tell us what is correct, and we don't question them. So it's this hierarchy within the society where people who are less learned, or maybe even people who are just female, or people who are at lower like say levels within that hierarchy of society, will do what they're told without questioning those authorities. That's what the authoritarian culture means.
Okay. The next question is, do you know of any effects or legacies that Malala has left behind on laws? And if you don't, like, what can you predict based on her position in our cultures? Like,
Okay.
okay.
So, specific legacies, like what people have learned from her and what they've said they've learned, I can't give you accounts of those.
Okay.
But I can say that I imagine she seems to me to be celebrated amongst many in the West, and even amongst some within her home society, and also hated by others, which is why she's under protection and not living in Pakistan any longer.
Yep.
I would imagine that her standing up was the equivalent of a slap in the face to the Taliban. That a young girl would not be afraid to speak up for herself. That'd be inconsistent with their expectations, and that was a way of undermining their authority. On the ground in Pakistan, I don't know what kind of impact she has had specifically.
Do you think that
Okay.
Oh, sorry. Do you think that she could affect any laws directly? Like, influence other countries to help?
That's a really good question. So, where the Taliban is active, the Pakistani state is not. So, Pakistan's state could implement laws, in response to her influence, or, after influence. By the way, Pakistan's one of the countries that had a woman president, or prime minister, years and years ago.
Yeah.
So they're not, if you want to think about, not being open to women in leadership, they're not a great example of that as a state. The Pakistan state is relatively weak, and it is not a democracy in the way we understand democracy in the West. It is likely that elements within the state actually support the Taliban, even though the state itself may not support the Taliban. So some political actors within the state might be supportive of the Taliban, even though the state itself is a secular state that has had women in the highest positions of leadership. But where the Taliban operates in Pakistan, same in Afghanistan, that's area that is not under the control of another state. They operate in the stateless territories that are within the borders of what we understand to be Pakistan, but not within the area where the Pakistani state actually has considerable authority. So they have a lot of autonomy there. If Malala has an influence on any law, that would most likely be the Pakistani state's law, but not necessarily the Taliban's practices.
Okay.
Although I can imagine, is there any leeway in terms of the interpretation of Islam that is maintained by leadership within the Taliban? I could see them giving concessions, perhaps, if that meant them staying in power. But for most fundamentalist organizations, including the Taliban, that's very unlikely. They tend not to moderate or give in. Again, black or white, good or evil. So I can't imagine that the Taliban's going to change much.
Okay.
At least in the short run.
Okay. For our last question, based on your knowledge, like excluding the Taliban, what would be the opinion of like common people in Pakistan? Like if you took without the Taliban's opinion, what would others have to say about women like Malala who take a stand?
Okay, so Pakistan is diverse like the United States is diverse. There's some here in the United States, just like there's some in Pakistan, people who are very conservative or even having very religious extremist views, interpretations of Christianity here, and that's true in Pakistan, though the dominant religion is Islam. There are also people who celebrate the intelligence of women and respect women and educate women and women who are well educated. There are wealthy people and there are poor people, and there does seem to be some divide in terms of those who are middle class or upper class within Pakistani society having more exposure to others and being maybe less influenced by the authoritarian culture. I do know a few Pakistani people in particular who live in Pakistan or have lived, so I can speak a little bit of what they have suggested of their understanding. Not everyone is a fundamentalist Muslim. Not every woman stays at home and raises kids. And, some women, get higher education. Many do. Not necessarily the numbers we see in the United States and elsewhere, but they get their nails done. They go to hair salons. There's a reference to one of the major cities of Pakistan being like the place to go for spa treatment. Women are like women elsewhere. But there is a difference between those in the urban cores, like the urban centers, and those who live in the countryside. And there's a difference not only in terms of the reach of the state, which affects the protections of women's rights, but also with regard to the level of, conservative, the numbers, I guess I should say, of the proportion of people who practice more conservative versions of Islam. And that might be cosmopolitan versus more, the urban cosmopolitan, culture that can be a little bit more secular, meaning non-religious, and a little bit more influenced by, exposure to other ideas than the conservative, rural countryside where people aren't exposed to other ideas as freely. And it's the rural areas, especially the tribal areas, where the Taliban has more of an influence. So you can imagine we don't have this kind of grand dichotomy on the scale that the United States don't have this on the same scale that we find in Pakistan. But we do have, variations in terms of liberal ideas, how we define equality, how much we want, our moral codes that are taught to us by, in religious context to be implemented in our state. Even how we want certain subjects in our state to be taught. It's just that seems to be a much greater divide, more polarized in Pakistan, based on my understanding.
So,
like I said, I've never been on the ground in Pakistan. I've never been there, so my ability to speak for Pakistani people is very limited. Just secondary sources and conversations with friends and colleagues who are from there.
Yeah. Do you think that people that she was trying to help, like people that actually knew her, could be mad at her for taking a stand?
It's possible. Just like, as I said, in any place we can have diversities of opinions on what's right or wrong, and what's appropriate or inappropriate. And she acted out in a way that wasn't consistent with how the authorities saw her role. And it's possible that some of the other women and girls may have disagreed with her as well. Either her position or maybe even her tactics. Speaking out publicly, being a tactic. But I don't know for sure.
Okay. Those were all the questions. So
awesome. You asked some really good questions, and like I said, there's some questions that I can't answer as well as can others because I don't have that experience.
Yeah.
But you also asked a lot of questions for which there are competing answers, which are good questions.
Thank you.
Yeah. So I hope that you're. So tell me, you're giving a presentation?
Huh?
And for your class?
Oh, it's for it's a national competition for like, so we go to states in April where we compete against different schools, and you get to research anyone in the world in history who took a stand.
Yeah. Okay, so do you need any other sources for your research?
I don't know, Emma. Hold on.
Okay.
Do we?
We have a lot of sources already, but I think we're good at it.
Okay.
Yeah.
No, I think we're good.
Oh, good. Very good. Well, best of luck to you guys, and feel free to send me an email. Let me know how the competition goes. I'd be interested in hearing.
Okay. Thank you.
All right. All right. You're welcome.
Bye.
Okay.
Oh my God.
Oh, good.
Yeah, that was good, except she ranted a couple times.
Oh yeah, but